the Thursday next month on Thanksgiving?
It is also.
We already picked a
yes,
date. I think we're doing the 15th. I think something like that, right?
We have a speaker.
We will. Oh, actually, if December's going to be, if we're going to skip December again, I was actually going to say let's do this again next month. This is always fun if I can find enough people. But we'll see. We have no plans for November.
Right. Okay.
It's
So
a date.
are we on?
We are.
All right.
So
No, hang on.
when you're ready, you just
hold
it down for a second.
All right. Well, let's just do that.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So what I want everybody to do is I want everybody to look at the camera and say thank you, Digital Primates, for the free beer and pizza. Thank you, Digital Primates. Right. They are our sponsor. And we have to say thank you to our sponsors so that we get more free pizza and beer. We very much appreciate it. All right. It's lightning talks. So what we're going to do is we're going to have somebody talk, and then we're going to have a break, whatever, and we'll just keep rotating till about 8 o'clock, hopefully. Okay?
Is anyone here named Wes?
Is anyone here named Wes? Would anybody like to be called Wes? You have a speaking opportunity.
Take your time.
I've got more time than I expected.
I will give you half an hour.
Half an hour, really?
I will, but I don't think...
Just do what you're going to do. But
Yeah.
I was trying to cram everything in.
Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, long Q&A, I guess. So, hello, everybody. I know many of you, for those who don't know me, my name is Todd Mantell. I am, what's my title? Principal Software Engineer Developer at the Washington Post. I'm wearing my Democracy Dies in Darkness shirt as a true company man. So, so when I saw that we were going to be doing lightning talks this month, so one of the things I love about this being a JavaScript meetup, as opposed to like a React specific meetup or a Vue specific meetup, especially because I wouldn't go to a Vue meetup. But the good thing about it being a JavaScript meetup is it gives us sort of a wide berth in terms of the different technologies and libraries we get exposed to. And so, you know, in the last year, we've had Angular and Vue, and maybe a year ago, Joe did his React thing. I did a GraphQL thing earlier in the year.
That was last October, you're right.
Was it? Wow, memory is on point today. And so we get all these new technologies and libraries, but I love JavaScript. JavaScript is cool, right? I actually started as a C# developer, so I was a back-end person, and then gravitated more to full stack, and then did a lot more JavaScript over time, and really just fell in love with it, to the point that now all I do is JavaScript. I do Node.js and GraphQL and React. So long story short, I really wanted to do some JavaScript, just some real language stuff, because it's a quirky but really cool language. And so when I was thinking about lightning talks, I thought, well, what could I do in like 10 to 15 minutes? And I thought, well, hoisting. I was thinking maybe prototypal inheritance or some other stuff, and I thought, well, let's go with hoisting. So before I go any further, there's a trigger warning. So this talk will involve the var keyword. Yay! Anyone, I'm sure Joe feels this pain, anyone who had to use the var keyword before ES6, I'm sorry for triggering any previous trauma. So as I said, I was a C# developer. And so one of the things that, one of the things that really threw me when I started learning JavaScript, I didn't have the REPL open. So I know I gave all this praise to JavaScript, and now I'm going to show you some C#. But this is like the simplest C# you could possibly see. So we have a processor class that writes stuff to the console and instantiate the class and run it. And so this is going to be super exciting. If it works, boom, we get some stuff to the console. Wow, how awesome was that? Let's build the new unicorn app. But if you notice in this class, I've got I'm declaring a variable and assigning it a value at the bottom of the class, right? And so when I started doing JavaScript, you'd have stuff like this, right? An equivalent bit of code that has a variable declared and logs it out. So let's run that. I hope you can see the bottom. It's going to be tricky at some real estate. Let's do this. And so let's run this code. Again, also super exciting code. And we get undefined. We don't get this stop quote. We get undefined, which coming from an OOP language is strange, and some of that is because of the way JavaScript works versus a compiled OOP language. But why does that really happen? And the answer to that question is something called hoisting. And so this is I went to the W3C schools for this definition, mostly so I could make fun of the W3C school site. You can see all the really wonderful styling and up-to-date design they have. But their definition is, and this is a very common definition and commonly understood definition of hoisting. Hoisting is JavaScript's default behavior of moving declarations to the top. What that means is, if we look at my sample code, what they're saying is this declaration gets moved up to the top. The problem with that declaration is that hoisting is not a real thing. And the reason for that is it's just a metaphor. So they came up with hoisting. There's some stuff that happens under the covers and under the hood of the JavaScript engine. And so that's what I'm gonna touch on, because I feel like it gives you a more complete understanding of how hoisting works, as opposed to, it's not true that the JavaScript engine goes through and it actually moves your code up. Your code doesn't go anywhere. This is from the MDN site, and Mozilla. I don't know what the DN stands for, but it's Mozilla's doc site.
Development Network.
Development Network, thank you. Which is great, because basically they take the ECMA 262, which is the JavaScript specification, and they actually give it to you in more readable language. And as those of you know, Brendan Eich was the creator of JavaScript, and he was at Mozilla for quite a while. I think one of the founders. He's not there anymore. And so anyway, so if you don't already, I'm sure many of you do, but if you don't, if you ever have a question, go into Google, type whatever you're looking for in MDN, and it'll take you to MDN, and MDN's awesome. But they define hoisting, or this particular sentence is what I want to focus on. Hoisting was thought up as a general way of thinking about how execution contexts, that's the phrase I want you to remember, specifically the creation and execution phases, work in JavaScript. However, the concept can be a little confusing at first. So what that says is, so the JavaScript engine, interpreter / compiler, we could have a whole 30-minute argument about whether it's an interpreter versus a compiler. The real answer is yeah. None of both. And so what happens is when JavaScript interprets / compiles your code, there are two phases. So the first phase, it runs through your code, it finds any declaration. And I'm using the general word declaration because it covers more than just variable declarations. It registers all those declarations and stores them in memory. And then it runs through again and it executes the code. So how does that apply to the code I showed you before? So, and this is very simple, right? But we've got, sorry, let me get rid of that tooltip. So this goes through and it registers this stock quote variable, right? And that's the creation phase. There's no other declaration. I don't have any other I mean, obviously it's not a real program where we have like tons of variables and a bunch of junk that we've written. So it registers that. But notice I said there was an execution phase, and an assignment of something to a variable is execution, right? It's not part of the declaration / initialization. So what that means is that what's really going on here is this happens. So it registers this part of it, and when the JavaScript engine registers a variable declaration, and we'll get to this. When you're using the var keyword, it assigns it undefined. So this is why people say it moves your code up, but it doesn't really, because what happens is it comes through in the creation phase, it stores it, and now in the execution phase, it's already got the stock quote. And the stock quote is undefined. So if we did this, I should not have done it that way. And then we get rid of all of this. Does anybody know what's going to happen? We get the stock quote. Right? Yay!
Yay.
So that worked. So that fundamentally is what hoisting is about. I'm still going to use the word hoisting, but I want you to keep thinking of it in terms of this two-pass cycle. So there's, let's see, no. So that's with the var keyword. But in ES6/ES 2015, we got some more keywords. Because var, I guess I have more time so I can talk about this. So var is a little bit problematic because it is not block scoped. So to give you an example, let's look at this. Let me run this. So here's the thing, right? I'm declaring the stock price in a block, but it's still hoisting like it's not even in the block, and that's because the var keyword was function scoped, not block scoped. If anybody has questions about that, that might be a good question. So let's go back to our basic hoisting. So we got in ES6, we got the let and const keyword. Does anybody know what's going to happen here? And don't be afraid to have the wrong answer. Sometimes, with really technical stuff, we're always like, oh, I'm going to look stupid. But like, sometimes you just got to say it.
I have no idea.
I look stupid anyway. It's going to fail.
It's going to give you an error.
So you guys think it's going to fail? What's the failure?
No, I said I don't know. Honestly, I would never write it down.
I know. Well, I'm glad you said that,
It's going
Joe.
to come through as undefined.
So it's going to come through as undefined. You think it's going to throw an error? What's that?
Variable not found,
Variable not found.
Right.
or something like that.
So what it's going to give us is
Exception.
Oh. It's node errors.
it's going to throw a reference error. So here's what's happening. And so here's what happens. So technically, behind the scenes, and I've read varying accounts of this, it does actually still store this. Well, it's going to store the variable in memory, right? Because that's what it does. That's what those two phases are. But with let and const, it does not initialize the variable to. It doesn't initialize the variable the way that var does. So when the TC39, the standards body that governs the JavaScript standards, what they did, and why I liked what Joe said, is they said, well, even if it can work that way, it doesn't mean it should. So let's not repeat the same problem that we had with var, where you can have, obviously if you have stuff where you're declaring variables all over the place and then using wherever the hell you want, you're going to get bugs. I'm here to tell you, you are going to have bugs, and probably lots of them, and they're going to be very painful. And so what they said is, okay, well, the engine's still going to work the same way it does, but when you use a let or const, and const is, it kind of would really not make sense to do this with const, because const is meant to be assigned. We're going to throw a reference error if you try to do that. And there is another term for that, and since it's Halloween, the temporal dead zone. Ooh. And so this is one of those things that sounds kind of like there's a lot involved, but there's not really. Actually, I haven't done it. So the TDZ, or temporal dead zone, just says it's the region of a program where a variable or a parameter cannot be accessed until it's initialized, i.e. received a value, right? And so essentially, in this very simple, and it doesn't work as well with a small amount of code, but essentially it's saying, this is the temporal dead zone. for this stock quote. You can't use it until you get here. Once you're here, you can use it wherever the hell you want. Which isn't to say that you have to assign a value to it immediately. Because you can also do this, and that's not a problem. Right? This is going to output the stock quote. Does anybody know what stock quote is there before it gets assigned that?
Undefined.
Undefined, exactly. Because it's not defined, it doesn't have a value yet. So constant let will throw a reference error. The big takeaway from the TDZ is just simply, and let me give you another example actually, because with more code. Right, so here we got,
So basically, before you put the bar, does it allocate or what do you?
Yeah, when you use var, it's not the assignment that's hoisted, it's the declaration that's hoisted.
it's the left side.
Yeah.
It's the left side that gets wasted. So in a larger program, right, all of this would be technically the temporal dead zone for stock quote. It's stock quote's temporal dead zone, which just is a complicated way of saying, hey, dummies, don't use this before you've assigned it a value. Make sense?
Now, just real quick, what would happen if that was inside a loop and the definition was at the end of the loop? So the first time through you'd get an error. What would happen the second time through?
Wow.
I think you just bomb out
Yeah.
because it throws a reference error, right?
You never get to the
Well,
second.
you could trap the error.
Well, exactly, and that's a good point, and I put this down here. So one of the benefits, this was going to be one of my takeaways, one of the benefits is that it does throw, right? So if you have your try-catch handling blocks, you can catch it and do whatever you want with it, but maybe you just don't do that.
That's probably
and then you don't have to catch it. But that being said, that's easy to say. In practice, we've all done stuff where you go back to, you're like, what was I doing here? And so the benefit is that those of us who worked with var instead of constant let, trying to debug was a major pain because you're getting all these undefined in console logs and in various places, and like, it's way better to get a stack trace because the stack trace will tell you where there's a problem. Undefined just is like, well, good luck. How am I doing on time?
So, Todd.
Yeah.
Stupid question.
There are no stupid questions.
No, I have lots of stupid questions.
Only
Why on
bad
earth would you
motivations.
write 20 lines of code and then try and declare a variable?
Thank you. Thank you.
Exactly.
So I love the theory and the demonstration, but surely no one thinks like that.
No, it happens all the
It
time.
can happen.
Why? Why would it happen?
Refactoring
Run
happens.
across an error in
You-
JavaScript that
you and I have
doesn't
seen
define,
very
you
different
realize
No,
you
no, no,
cases.
no. Why would you use a variable you know you haven't defined yet?
you
Because-
defined it.
Because what happens, or can easily happen, is you've written your code, you did the definition down here, and then at some other point in time, you have to go back and maintain your code, and you know you've got the variable, but now you're trying to do something up here, and you say, oh, this variable exists in your mind, so you go ahead and use it, not realizing that your definition was really
No,
down.
I'm sorry. My JavaScript has all the definitions at the top. I have nothing
Right.
before. And if I
Because-
need to declare something, it's going at the top.
As they
Or
should.
in the function.
Right, exactly as they should. And that's
Right here.
the
But
point of
again,
it.
why would you declare something at the bottom of your code?
Well, you should, I mean, I would always argue you should not.
No, never. God.
Who was?
But
He was. He was coming from C#. So I guess if you're a C# developer first, it doesn't matter.
here's the thing, it would not be a good practice in C#. In C#, you declare all of your instance variables at the top.
Well, that's what I mean. That's basically that.
But in C#
People coming
you'd
from-
get away with it. Is that the difference?
No, the
No,
compiler
but
throws
it's
it
basically
there, so there's no-
your mentality is kind of like the C# mentality, meaning that you have to deal with what's defined. Well, with JavaScript, this is kind of like, you throw anything at it and it kind of works.
Yeah.
So it's a completely
So anyway,
different
Mark, to
mentality.
answer,
So it's
to
like-
answer your question, you should not. That's my point of this is like, hey, do this thing. It's like, no, this clearly shows what the engine actually does.
Right.
When I
right,
get
right.
to questions, we're getting the spin out of control here. I'll get to I'll get to questions in like 5-10 minutes.
Yeah, he's got like
Probably
10
the
minutes
Friday.
left.
So
Just
So no, hold on.
Yeah.
We'll get to questions. You'll have question time. No. You're gonna have question. You're gonna have question time. Right now is my time.
Oh!
No, I don't mean that harshly. I just mean I'm running out of time.
You say, has anybody got any questions? You don't ask any questions.
I actually didn't ask questions. As for questions, we will get to questions in like 5 minutes. So, functions. I mentioned earlier that declarations get stored in memory in the creation phase, right? So there are multiple ways to declare functions in JavaScript, and the two main ones. I mean, I don't know that I've ever declared a function in a different way, but there are function expressions, which are very common, and you basically declare a variable and then store a function as that variable's value. And then there's function declarations, where you use the function keyword. I know some people are not huge fans of the function keyword. Here's the thing. Functions, because they are declarations in and of themselves, are stored in memory in the creation phase, which means that you can declare a function with the keyword anywhere and use it. So let me give you an example. And I am actually almost done. So, I have a little fake API here. Runs. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So that's running. So here's the thing. This is also fairly simple. So we've got a main. We've got two functions that are function declarations that are below the invocation, and it's going to call this main is going to call this function, which calls an API that returns some stock data. Right, and we get C, but we get the data. Now, if I did this, and actually I'll use the equals.
Calm down,
Yep, that's it.
even VSTS code goes. No.
What do we think we're going to get here? You guys?
We'll delete main before the break there?
I don't
Or main,
think that's
function
gonna
main?
run at all.
We get a type error. Does anybody know why we get a type error? The reason we get a type error
Main.
is what happens. It goes through, and don't worry about the squigglies. I think it's just not like my style. So what happens with hoisting, right? The left side. So main here is undefined. So we've essentially tried to execute undefined.
This being is not a function, right?
So all that means
That's a good
is,
way to define something undefined. Get a name.
What's
Like
that?
It says main is not a function instead of undefined is not a function. It's a good pattern. You just revealed some shit here.
did I? So then we just do this, and then it should work. And there we go, right? And obviously, if I click in there, if I hadn't done that, and we do this, what are we going to get? We should get a reference error, right? Because of the temporal dead zone, because this is the TDZ for main. It can't be used before here, right? And let's run it. I didn't save. I didn't save. Hold on. And there we go. We get a reference error. So, takeaways before I get to your questions. Creation and execution phase, those are the two key things to take away from hoisting. Hoisting isn't really a thing, it's just a way of sort of imagining it, but it makes even more sense if you think about the two phases. Always declare let before you use it. Obviously, you want to assign const. Const will actually give you an error that you didn't initialize it. And it wouldn't make sense for it to not have a value, right? Because it's a constant and it's not meant to be reassigned to. It is shallow immutable. It's not actually immutable. People know. Prefer let and const over var. I mean, I can't really think of a use case where I'd prefer to use var. I'm sure there's always a use case for something. Because of block scope and, as I mentioned, stack traces. And then the controversial one, I recommend preferring function declarations over function expressions because I prefer the step-down rule, Uncle Bob's step-down rule, where you go from top to bottom. However, I know many people prefer function expressions. Always declare them at the top if you don't want to, if you don't like getting errors. And per like the Airbnb style guide, if you're going to prefer function expressions, and there are instances where I prefer function expressions. Usually as like the main, like what would be in an OOP sense, my public function I'll usually use because it's got to be at the top anyway. And that's going to be my main function. I'll use that at the top. But keep them small, like the Airbnb style guide recommends. And that's the way the news goes. Questions? You had a question. I'll get to you too.
Can you show again what's the difference between function expression? I just want to make sure I know which one I did wrong.
Oh, sure.
When I show my demo.
Sure.
You've wrecked her talk, Tom.
So function expression is a variable that you assign a function to.
Yeah.
And function declaration is, disregard the async stuff.
Yeah.
I probably should have not put async in there. It's too many keywords. It's just when you say function, blah, 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 and then you have your block. And that's the one that gets stored in memory in the creation phase, as opposed to a function expression, which is a variable with a reference to the function.
You could also, I mean, you could have had the function keyword in the first example as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I really like arrow functions. It's just so terse, you know, especially anonymous. But yeah, Joe's right. I mean, I could have, just like I did here, you can have a named function expression too. And actually before ES6, it probably would have been preferred that you do it that way because of your errors and stack traces, because it'll actually tell you the function name and give you more info. Whereas an anonymous function expression might not give you that information. But I believe the set function name in ES6, which is under the covers, takes care of that for you, which is why sometimes now you get better stack traces with arrow functions, anonymous arrows. You had something.
Just about the hosting still. So actually I can think that it's a correction that JavaScript does if you write the variable in the wrong place.
Think of it as a correction. I don't know that I would think of it as a correction because in some ways, like Mark so subtly pointed out, why would you ever really want to do it, right? So it's more like just kind of how it works because Brendan Eich wrote everything in 10 days and as a POC, and it ended up becoming a language. Like every POC becomes something bigger than it was supposed to be. Other questions? Megan?
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the left and right read when things are being read through and run through, I should say?
Sure, yeah. So what I mean by left and right, I mean like anything left of the equals is a declaration. Anything to the right is actually code that's being executed, right? So I'm trying to think, like this is an actual operation. Like it's, and I'm explicit about that because I think even my brain sometimes thinks of it as like one, we see it as one thing, right? And I think especially because of like math and all the things we're used to, we see it as like one whole operation.
That's the hard thing to really figure out is like, okay, you as human beings, as Americans, we read from left to right, and then the fact that we're going to go backward now and then do something with that, it's a concept that's difficult to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't come up with this.
It's all total.
What do people who are used to Arabic do? Because they read right to left. Megan, did that answer the question?
I guess I'm trying to understand the order. So when it starts on the left and it, does its thing, it moves upward or saves that thing. When does it start to then shift to the right and reading that way?
After it's done with all the declarations.
Okay.
So just think of it as like, it comes through, it goes through all of this, and now it's got a function in memory, and it's got this main variable in memory. I don't know what it does. It must do the same with the library import. And then it comes through again, and it executes everything. And the execution is invoking this function, it's doing this assignment, it's, I guess that's it. No, it's probably doing this too. Because these are all also hoisted too.
Okay.
Yeah, I had some fun stuff like that. Like this one. So what is that? Is that time? One last little thing. Does anybody have a guess what this is gonna output? So we've got an inner scope or outer scope variable, and then we redeclare it, which you should never do. But it's one of those like, hey, this is fun to see how the JavaScript engine works. Does anybody have a guess what this is going to give us?
Yeah, it's going to call override, so it's going to.
That's true.
Okay, it's going to output inner scope. I love inner scope.
Oh my God, it's undefined.
Oh,
This gets stored in memory, hoisted, and it's undefined, and it's the same thing. But it totally plays with your
But
brain.
it
because
gets
you got-
hoisted to the top
Trick
of the function.
question.
to the top of the function.
Yeah.
And that's a great point. And I should have put this in. Obviously, so this works within functions too. Remember, JavaScript is function scope. But out here is also a scope. It's in Node, it's global. In the browser, it's the window. So yeah. I'm out of time.
I just
Yeah,
found a great example of why this thing actually can happen. Basically, you've got a declaration of the same variable inside of a function and outside of the function, and
Yeah, if you're no longer showing.
the function is being called twice, and
Just hold it down for a second.
causes basically the first one to be undefined and the second one being defined. So now you've got two different behaviors calling the same function with code that actually study.
Quit pressing the goddamn.
Right. Thank you, Todd.